I do most of my musing in that Scylla and Charybdis on the 14 between the Empire and the Gyratory. And I was thinking today about resistance, or what I knew about Rushton when I was at his school. I hated all my schools, by the way, even the one he founded. And we knew three things really. One, that we had this vague idea that at one point he'd intervened where the staff were eating all the children's food and made sure we got as good stuff like they did. And I also found that we also knew that he'd always said what was unfair. And we were never quite sure what he proposed to do about it, but we all had that feeling that he was on our side. That fear of resistance, I think, rubbed off on me. Because when you're young, it's easier, isn't it? Because all you have to do is to think of your kind of resistance heroes. My wall had pictures on. I had the odd Everton picture as well, like, but as well as that, yeah, that helps with resistance. That helps with resistance as well. But I also had on my wall this amazing anarchist bloke called Six Fingers, who held off several of Franco's regiments for 3 weeks in 1934. And of course, I also found that Ned Kelly had sent to Brussels for Marxist pamphlets. And when they'd made these suits of armour, and when he'd escaped from the hotel at Glenrowan, only surrounded by 300 Australian policemen, aye, that's a bit of a misnomer. When he realised his other three mates hadn't got back, he went back in. I learnt my resistance from the hopeless, the bereft, the bewildered, and the people who just realised that in the end, you can't just take it anymore. The Jewish community in Warsaw, the Palestine community in Gaza, there's so many of these people who've realised, without putting any particular political name on it, without trying to analyse what will happen next, then there just comes a time when you just got to resist, even though everybody would tell you that it's hopeless. Rushton's causes were twofold. Obviously, any nation, any equality, any inequality, from the obvious the slavery question, the position of the Polish people occupied by Russia, the position of Ireland occupied by the English, and these causes left him in a minority, but a very strong minority of those people who he agreed with, those friends he had. But often he took an even more radical view, so found himself in a minority within that minority. So not only having to argue with those who opposed to him, but often having to persuade his friends, and they were friends, that they had not gone far enough and there was more to be done. He worked in a time of oppression. The nation was at war. The first casualty of war is truth. It was in 1914, it was in 1793 with Pitt. He was fighting the same time, he was fighting the battles in a time of oppression, where a meeting of three people might be considered illicit and illegal, and even corresponding societies, that's people who obviously contact each other by letter or whatever, even they were in danger and would sometimes have to cease their meeting. But the extraordinary thing was, of course, that he had to do everything by memory. There was no system, nothing had been invented, by which he could remember anything he was taught. And the memory is the only part of my body that still works, apparently. So I know what it's like. And I never write anything down for at least 5 or 10 minutes to give myself some chance to retain it and to train it. But he had to do that without any obvious means of collecting information, and it seems that he had a wide general knowledge and could converse with his contemporaries and others on the subjects of the day. And that, in his own position, was miraculous. I don't like particularly to comment on the disability itself, but obviously many of you will be aware, I think, that he had no sight at all. And he lost his sight by his defence or by helping those people who were to be enslaved, to be sold. He could no longer deal with the old myth of that they were inferior, and he could no longer do that once he knew them, once he'd spoken to them, once he was attached to them, and once he'd helped. This myth by which so many people were able in this town to continue in a trade was something which he opposed. His first opposition on board ship led him on a chain of events which meant in the end that he was estranged from many of those people within his community. But throughout his life, if you had a meeting and England and Scotland were playing Georgia on BT Sports 2, and you thought you might not get an audience, they were by the way, and you thought you might not get an audience for the cause because of Strictly or the football or whatever, you wanted somebody to second your motion and just speak for those 3 minutes before the matter went for a debate. Rushton was your person. A wind-swept platform on an open street down by the pier, down by the dock. And when the abolitionists came here to collect their information on the lives of those people who worked in the trade, Rushton amazingly was the man they used to get their contacts, to get their survey, and to get the kind of information that they wanted to present to the House of Commons. The third reason I loved him from a very early age, without really knowing why, was books. Because one of the things he did was to pay somebody to read to him. I sometimes get money off the government to pay my reader, but the point is, it was that idea that he would have someone read to him so he could gain that information. And that's, again, this idea that the information he gained, he had to retain and remember. General knowledge would not be as valued today as it has been in earlier times, when a quick Google could find you the best 20 restaurants in Minsk. There may no longer be a need to remember the capital cities of the old Soviet republics. In my day, to know things for the sake of it was of some value. It was what you could manage to know about subjects that you weren't particularly interested in, that might set you apart and might make it worth a conversation. I suspect that Rushton would bemoan the lack of interesting conversation. When did any of you, apart from here, last year a political conversation in a pub? Well, I don't know, maybe you go to better ones than me. Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be with you tonight. I admire your conviction for your cause. My problem, of course, was that once I'd studied all these heroic resistors, and they still fascinate me and I still collect them, and then, of course, like everyone else, I believed that that something could be done about it. And the problem for me, and I'm glad obviously not for you all, was that I started to read so much history that the only thing that became obvious to me was the fallibility of the human condition and its inability to do anything apart from, as O'Casey once gloriously said, the world being in a state of chassis. We stumble forward, we get pushed back, and in the end, we decide, I think, to try and do good and be good to our friends and stand up for the right where we see that it is wrong, as Rushton did. As to going further and to prescribe anything for it, I think that's where I might now find some difficulty. But Rushton's view was straight and steady. And that glorious moment, a kind of first round Wimbledon moment, when Nadal or Federer might be whacked by somebody from Kazakhstan, when he sent that glorious letter to that slaveholder Washington to expose the myth that was in the United States at his beginning, and every morning I still get hammered at me by the media. If Mr. Rushton was here now, I hope he would join me in campaigning.